Hey gang, this is our week 4 quick video for big summary and messiest issues. This is a newish thing for us. We're going, and as I said, I'm going to post one for the realism and idealism chapters, but I wanted to get this to you ahead of our discussion on Thursday. So just keep in mind, and I will let you know when I post the other two. But just keep in mind, this is going to be super short. I'm going to keep it under. I'm shooting for like 8 minutes so that you all will actually watch this. But this is just an inclusion of the big summary that we do every single week. So again, it's way overly simplified, but it's just a super simple summary of the chapter or the reading, and delve into the term I stole from a colleague, messiest issues, which basically, excuse me, are just a couple things I think might help you to have my take on as you're reading before we come into discussion on Thursday. This is not meant to say we're not going to discuss these things on Thursday, and this is not meant to be a full discussion, just kind of a quick, hey, think of it like this. If you're having trouble with this portion, then here's my thought. Okay, so this week, and again, I'm going to do this every week prior to Thursday. It's looking like it's going to always be probably first part of the week. I'm going to try to post it prior to Wednesday so you have some actual time, but it'll probably be Monday or Tuesday evenings is when I usually get this out. If I'm really doing well, it'll be Sundays, but first part of the week, just to give you a little time to have a chance to have a different take on what you're reading, okay? And then, as I said, we're going to dive into everything on Thursday nights as always. So this week 4, you had 2 chapters. No, you had 1 chapter, excuse me, chapter 3, and you had an article about religion and higher education. So let's start with Osmond chapter 3, Eastern Philosophy, Religion, and Education. Here's the big summary, okay? So I promised you all that I would have this. I said last week when you guys were all furiously taking notes with my big summary that this would be included in the PowerPoint. So here it is. So here's the big summary. And I feel like because this is recorded now and it's not just us in class, I have to like give a disclaimer that this is way overly simplified. And the point of this is twofold. One, just to give you a very simple distilled down version of what it is we're taking a look at, but also because as we discussed, I think this is a real need in our field, and in any complex field, but just to be able to communicate complex ideas in a real simple fashion. So hopefully I'm modeling that for y'all. But here it is, chapter 3, the big summary. So this chapter obviously is about Eastern philosophy, religion, and education. The first point is religion and philosophy are often intertwined. It might be easier just to think of these as a way of thinking or experiencing the world. It sounds familiar language, right? That's how we kind of talk about philosophy. Second, Eastern traditions tend to focus more on the inner self and less on scientific inquiry as a way of understanding the world. Social order is also important in many of these schools of thought. So self and social order, okay? So understanding the self is a part of the social order. 3, Eastern traditions include those from China, India, Japan, and the Middle East. And even though they can seem contradictory to Western thought, they have been hugely influential of Western thought. That paradigm we're going to delve into a little bit in messiest issues here in a second. Next, Eastern philosophies have no one goal of education, but do focus a lot on progress. And education is obviously a consistent thread through most of these. The student and teacher relationship is central in many of these philosophies, sacred in some. And finally, to say Eastern religion and philosophy, just to use that term, is building a big tent. What I mean is that that's super broad and about as overly simplified as this big summary is. There's no one source of these schools of thought and or their educational methods, which is basically a way to think about how they've been passed down. That's as varied as their origins. So the idea there with that last one is this is an overly, it's maybe that's unfair, but this is a very simplistic look at Eastern traditions, and to even just use that terminology is pretty broad. So just try to think of this as a way to start understanding a school of thought, or a set of traditions which can be a little bit different from the set of traditions and schools of thought in which we are typically rooted in this class, and particularly in American higher education, which is Western. Okay, so there's our big summary. Next, I want to get into a couple of issues which I thought might be just a little bit, excuse me, confusing. So the chapter uses the terms religion and philosophy, not interchangeably, but does dive back and forth. So I just wanted to highlight that they, I thought, provided a pretty good, simple definition, which is important right up front in the chapter. And you might have missed it because I think it was literally one sentence. So religion is a set of beliefs, ceremonies, practices, and worship. That's on page 77. Philosophy, as we've talked about ad nauseum already, is a way of viewing the world. We've talked about it as an investigative method, but in this context, we can think about it as a way of viewing the world. What we're looking at this chapter and the Eastern traditions in general, and in this context, think of it as both. Think of it as just a way of thinking, a way of experiencing the world, a way of understanding the world, a way of learning. Okay, and from the beginning, just remember that religions played a role in human endeavors, and particularly in higher education. So, why are we connecting the two readings we had? Hopefully that's clear, and we'll definitely talk about this more on Thursday. But because religion, or in this context, schools of thought and philosophical traditions, have had a huge influence on much of human history, but particularly on the development of higher education. Okay, so the point there is, don't get tripped up on terminology in terms of religion, school of thought, way of thinking, philosophy. Think of it in the broadest context possible as sort of human development and a way of thinking. Second, is Western thought antithetical to this or rooted in it? The answer is yes. So this is going to be, I think, one of the more fun parts on Thursday. But I just wanted, and I'm not going to get too much into it in this, but what I wanted to let you know is that if you come across that section and think to yourself that I thought you just said that Eastern tradition author is antithetical to the Western tradition, and now you're telling me that it's rooted in it, and that doesn't make any sense, that's understandable. The point is that something can be rooted in one thing and also develop to be in some ways counter to it, but it doesn't mean that those roots are gone. So Western thought's been developed in an antithetical way, or has become developed in that way, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't spurred from many Eastern thoughts. So think of the term, or the idea of progress, and this is something that I think we'll delve into quite a bit on Thursday. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you all highlight this as either a thing that stuck out or a challenge to you. But the idea of progress is hugely influential in Eastern thought, whether it's individual progress or societal progress, which is a theme that runs through most of the Eastern traditions that we were exposed to in this chapter. The advancement of the self and of society is really hugely important. It is viewed in a different way than it is in Western traditions, which is, but no less an important way. So it's very important in Western thought and in Eastern thought, but particularly in the modern Western context, it's viewed very differently. The author, I think, poses a pretty strong case that progress in Western thought is more, better, higher, farther, right? So think of our context in higher education. Progress is advancing through your degrees and hopefully to productive job, productive life, so on and so forth. That is not necessarily the way progress is thought of in Eastern thought. Sometimes progress in even related to education is so that one can develop a simpler life and return to nature. So just because, so again, this may be a confusing one. I think it's an interesting one. I want to talk more about it on Thursday, but just because a thing is rooted in something, or I'm sorry, just because a thing is different than something doesn't mean it's not rooted in it. So they are connected, although they look different today. And 3 and 4, these are the final ones. Eastern thought has no one goal of education. So largely it's about educating yourself so you can figure out your place in the world and so you can find your way through the world, and find your place. So I talked a little bit about that on some of the other issues, but again, Eastern thought is really rooted in some self-development, and then really the direction in which Eastern thoughts suggest that development lead are totally varied. That leads us to the aim of social change, or progress is almost always present, but often begins with individual change. So again, social change or individual change, if the goal is individual change, individual development in most of these traditions, then how can the goal also be social, or many people, the development of many people or society? Both can be true. So I think often, although maybe sometimes it's not said like this, what the case is that the development of the self is basically a means to that larger end. So if I develop correctly, let's say in the terms of Confucius, if I develop correctly into the perfect gentleman, then then my behavior will better society. So it's not always just about, although it's focused on the self, it's not just about the self often. So I thought that, again, that's one of those things where it might at first read like, what? I don't, those two things don't go well together. But it's just I think it's a matter of perspective and a matter of degrees. Okay. So again, super quick look at all these kind of things. The point here is I'm just hoping that can help you get over any little speed bumps as you're reading. We're going to talk about all these things on Thursday. Please feel free to bring them up. Hopefully I'm not adding any confusion. We're going to go on to Kohlbrenner, 1961. So the first thing in my big summary that I wanted you to see, was that was to remember that it was written in 1961. So there are a lot of sort of timely references, and I just thought it was important to remember that. Second, religion has always been a part of American higher education since the very beginning, but its role, especially its role compared to secular study or basically non-religious study, has always been at least a little unclear. So what I mean by that is even at the very beginning in Harvard, there was, I thought, a pretty interesting section in the article where we took a look at some of the founding language around Harvard. And there's a clear religious connotation, but there are also some suggestions of non-religious study and non-religious advancement through study. And so I think that that's always been the case. That's an important point, or has remained the case largely. Third, many religious institutions have struggled or not made it at all, so the success rate hasn't been very low. Colleges were often established to develop clergy and spread religion. And the final point that I'm noticing I didn't save or didn't type correctly is basically that religion has and still does play a central role in the development of American higher education, and the way that role has played out, or exactly what it looks like, has varied and will continue to vary, but it's going to continue. The assertion in this article is that it will continue to be a really important piece of American higher education, okay? And that its place in history can't be denied. So that's the big summary. Moving on. So here are a couple of the messiest issues, okay? This video is already running a little bit longer than I wanted it to. I'm sorry, so I'm going to try to run through these. Just two for this article, because I felt like it was a pretty, although not necessarily easy, but pretty straightforward historical look, excuse me, at some of the major roles of religion. So I'm hoping that, at least those are pretty intuitive. But there's a couple of things I thought might be interesting to you is this. So here's how I described it. Religion in higher education is a confused, clear, consistent, wavering, fledgling, successful history. So that doesn't make sense. I wrote it like that on purpose because I think that although it's been really, really prominent, and I think you see this in the article, the role of religion has been extremely prominent. It has never really been consistent other than in its presence. So it's always been there, except for it's just been there in a lot of different ways. It's been there to a lot of varying degrees of success and for a lot of different purposes, and still today. Sometimes it's unclear. I, for example, used to work at a Catholic university in Chicago where the brothers or the monks at the abbey across the street, who still had financial and organizational ties to the institution, were a part of the board, but it was often unclear what true formal role they played. And so that's just one example of, by the way, that had some implications on the institution's Catholic identity. I'll give you some examples of that because I think it's kind of interesting on Thursday. But the point here is, this is sort of a thread throughout the article, and I'm going to end with a quote that I think brings it home a little bit. But the point here is that religion has been a part of higher education. It's just been a part in a lot of really different kind of ways, and that's been either successful or not to a lot of varying degrees. And so here's the quote I want to leave you with on this article. Although the main outline of the pattern of the relations of religion to higher education seems to reveal an increasingly clear break, the questions that were once thought to be answered have a way of persistently reappearing. So first of all, remember this is written in 1961, so there's some historical context there. But the point is, as we've talked about in a few other contexts, this is cyclical. And there has been no one ongoing, consistent theme in terms of the impact of religion in higher education, other than that it's been present and impactful. Okay, so that's it for this this week's video, the messiest issues in big summary. Hopefully that's helpful, and I'm hoping that that'll help you all read through it and get through some of the readings this week in a little bit better fashion, or easier fashion, I should say. Again, we're going to go through all this stuff on Thursday night, and I will post this evening, and y'all let me know if I can help you out. Okay, have a good rest of the week. I'll see you Thursday.